Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Lordrusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about different flavors of buildcraft in roguelikes. This Parley is going to have some delicious definitions. So I'm going to read the prompt and then we'll go through a few of these things. What do we mean by roguelike here? What do we mean by buildcraft flavor, etc.? Lordrusty begins. So, I've noticed that there seem to be two very different flavors of buildcraft, which seem to be predominant at the moment, with the roguelike being very in vogue. In a session-based build system, there tends to be two possible ways a game judges if you're succeeding at making a build. The first is to simply see if you are keeping pace with the game. This model tends to ramp up difficulty linearly, and just ask that you make enough decent decisions to keep pace with it. An example most people in this community are probably familiar with is Hades. You can make good or bad choices, but your power level is within a set band most runs. Another game I've played this year with this model is Against the Storm, which, as long as you make some sort of point scoring engine, you should be fine. The other model is what I call the escape velocity model. These are games which have some quite sharp difficulty spikes, and typically get very hard by the end. The reason I've made this parlay is the game OTXO, which basically requires you to take some economy buffs in your build early if you want to have enough of a build going to clear later floors. People learning the game can take increases to power on early floors to better learn the game system, but in order to get a win, there's a skill check on being able to clear early floors with little to no buffs early on, in order to get enough lift to escape orbit early with a full build and tackle the last third of the game. Is this game literally about escape velocity, like leaving into space? Anyway, I've also seen this model in Monster Train and Across the Obelisk, which basically need you to have found some kind of combo to break the game before you reach the last act. There are also games which use both models. Slay the Spire's Heart Fight is a good example of this. Getting a victory just needs you to pick decent cards, but beating the heart needs you to make something busted. When and where have these models been deployed in games you've played, and how should they be best used? I'm salivating at all of these specifics and terms in this parlay, just to make sure we're on the same page, or if I've misinterpreted Lordrusty, at least you know. I am going to define a few of them for a minute, but ooh, baby, I wanted to stop like so many times during reading that because it's great. This is a smash hit as far as I'm concerned. Let's go. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is roguelike here. I think, in my notes, a good amount of the discussion that is going to come out of me for this topic is probably not going to be specific to roguelikes, but there are some interesting ways in which putting these design ideas, the keeping pace and escape velocity models you described, into a game that gives you random upgrades as you go and then they reset when you die, there are some interesting implications to that, but it's worth considering, I believe, that the keeping pace and escape velocity models may apply to other games, especially keeping pace as like a way of thinking about difficulty, escape velocity as a way of thinking about difficulty. I think that's useful. I think that will come up whether I want it to or not. But yes, specifically in roguelikes, here we're hand-waving the distinction on sort of what type or what kind of roguelike. You know, the game might be a more true or pure roguelike where you don't get upgrades between runs, you don't get stronger over time, but let's not worry about that for now. The genre normal, I would argue, has been that you do get upgrades over time. A roguelite, they are and were in the past even more often called, but I would argue that's just what the genre is now. There are almost no games that don't do that, so the term is meaningless. When I say roguelike, if you insist, I also mean roguelite for this parlay. I just don't think that's useful anymore. Anyway, I mean, that's clearly what Lordrusty means too, because almost all of these games you've mentioned do have, in-between run progression. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about is the session-based build system. This is a term from me, I think, that I'm not entirely sure it is useful, but it's useful to hear other people use it so I can decide for myself. We can all decide for ourselves. So thank you for giving it a shot. The idea is just that these are games that you step up, you don't have a build, you may have one you want to make in mind, but you don't have a build on your account, if you will. And then the game loop is you making a build. You make a build when you play. You get to play the build too, but when you start a run of Hades, you do not have a build as per se. Again, you might have one in mind, but you don't have boons. You know, you literally do not have boons. And you get them as you go, and then that resets when you die. Not just your upgrades reset as you die, your build appreciably resets when you die. And so while you can make a more or less similar build each time, depending on the game's balance, you get it. Now, this is important because when we talk about keeping pace and escape velocity models, I think it's going to become clear the more we discuss this that they correlate with the amount of control the player has, or they make more or less sense depending on the level of control the player has over the randomness. You could argue that keeping pace models are less roguelike than escape velocity models. That's like kind of my thesis statement. Let's get into each one. So what I'm going to do to structure this parlay is talk about the keeping pace one just on its own a lot, the escape velocity one on its own a lot, and then combining them or the benefits of each at the end. Let's go. Keeping pace. So this one, I mean, I feel like the benefit is pretty clear in theory. You get a build system where the game's challenge level meets the build's power level the most often, and I suppose that the most obvious trade-off would be you basically do that by relatively limiting the player's power. I like Lordrusty when you said your power level is within a set band most runs. That's interesting. That's true. I didn't really think about that before. My first note about this model is that the easiest way I can think of to do that is to limit the player's access to multipliers. Hades is a great example. I agree. In Hades, there's this mechanic, and listener, if you have not played Hades, this should be easy enough to understand. Hades is a game where you have a few basic attacks. You have your attack, your special attack, a cast, you shoot out a blood gem or you modify that to be shooting out something else. You have a few basic things you can do, and you can get boons that modify each of those things. But you can't get more than one boon that directly modifies each thing. So maybe you get an attack boon that makes your attack fire chain lightning. You hit someone with your sword, you also get chain lightning. You can get more boons that will make that do even more damage, but not directly. You can't get a boon that says your attack creates a wave that knocks enemies back and does more damage, on top of the boon that says your attacks do chain lightning. But there might be a boon that says something like when you do a lightning effect, enemies get hit with a second strike of lightning when they attack. And then you've, not really indirectly, but you get it, kind of indirectly, increase the power of that lightning attack boon. But the game will only let you do this so much. And in Hades, almost every source of damage is not multiplicative with other sources. So if something says your attack increases by 60%, other things in the game that say, your attack increases by 30%, that will always be just added to the 60% you already have. So you now do 90% more damage. You don't do 60% more damage and then multiply that total amount of damage by another 30%. You just add 30%. If you're not familiar with adding damage multipliers versus multiplying them, the short version is as these numbers get bigger, it's way less damage to be adding instead of multiplying. And if you think about it mathematically, you intuitively know this to be the case. So the game is kind of keeping your power level within a set band a little bit. I think that a less obvious consequence of that type of build system is that it gets cognitively more difficult to add damage to your build as your build gets bigger. Let me explain why. Let's say that you get 4 boons in Hades, 1 for your attack. You can't get more attack boons directly, so in this contrived example, you get your next boon for your special. That will increase your, kind of cycle damage output, maybe. You get a 3rd boon for, in this contrived example, your cast. And the 4th boon, let's say they're all lightning boons, and you get a boon that gives you more damage when you do a lightning effect. Now it's harder to find a boon in the game Hades that increases your damage, especially most of your damage. You see what I mean? Maybe you'll find a boon that says something like, when you cast, create an ice nova effect around you. Okay, so you found some way to increase your damage a little bit, but only when you're doing your cast, and it doesn't increase the damage you were already doing. It just gives you another thing that all your existing damage increases don't apply to, which does technically do more damage. If you want to think of it a different way, it's almost like the game has made it harder and harder to find a way to increase your like damage rotation damage, finding a place where you can fit damage in without forcing you to not do something that already did more damage, and finding something to add that your other damaging effects actually affect or play nice with is harder and harder the longer the run goes. So the difficulty of making a build increases over the course of the run. The difficulty of the content versus your power level seems intended to be relatively constant, but I would argue that the challenge for the build crafter is actually increasing over the course of the run. Each decision will make it more and more difficult to add something to the build that actually does something without stepping on something else's toes. Lots of systems that have limited opportunity cost, like meaningfully limited opportunity cost, have this phenomenon. So for example, if you play Warframe and you have really, really powerful setups for your Warframe's abilities, and you have a really powerful primary, and your Warframe is kind of buffing some of your primary weapons damage, it's becoming harder and harder to pick secondary and melee weapons that actually benefit you during gameplay. You have powerful things to do already, so unless they make those things more powerful and you essentially do not use them, they're not going to make you better off. They might give you something else to do. They give you a new thing to do, but they don't make your build stronger. So in a discussion about scaling the difficulty, you can see how, while Warframe is a game that makes the player very powerful, it does somewhat bound the player's level of power a little bit. There's only so strong you can get a thing to be before you have more space in your loadout, but it's just irrelevant. You could talk about it that way. Another way to look at it with the Hades example is that in Hades, if you were to create some big bongo combo where you do an attack and it creates a lightning strike and you get a second lightning strike and that creates a tsunami, and then the tsunami freezes the enemies and blah, 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 blah. Well, all that stuff happens on your attack when you trigger a lightning strike. So now that you have all those things, that's really good. But now if you were to get a cast boon that does a lot of damage, it would be surprisingly useless because you have to not attack to do the cast, which means all of those boons you just got don't do anything unless the cast is a very specific thing, a lightning strike. You see what I mean? It's not, maybe that doesn't make it harder to find something that will make the build more powerful, but it heavily reduces the number of options in the game that do anything that is beneficial, basically. We will get back to that when we get to the escape velocity model, but you can see, I think, that the main ramp up in the keeping pace model is probably usually going to be that it becomes more difficult to make a build decision that does anything, like that is meaningful at all. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean that at the end of the run nothing meaningful will happen. In Hades, toward the end of the run, you are about to fight the final boss, and a few minutes in gameplay time before you fight the final boss, you get a big shop, the shop in Styx, for people that have played Hades. And you can buy a lot of different boons. Now, you may not have enough money to buy all of those things, but the point is, you've gotten to the point where your build is quite involved, and it's very difficult to increase the damage of your build in any meaningful way. And what does the game do? Well, it gives you a larger than normal amount of options for what to get to try to increase your build further. So if you have in mind what would make the build stronger, you can use this opportunity to get the final key piece. And if you don't, getting a lot of upgrades without specifically in mind which ones will be beneficial will probably have a surprisingly low impact on your build. You won't actually gain much power, even though you will technically gain a lot of boons. Does that make sense? Thus, it creates a sort of knowledge challenge. I don't want to do an entire aside about this, but I think it's worth kind of putting a pin, maybe even for a future parlay, about knowledge type difficulty, rather than like you mechanically need to do something harder with your hands, or you need to have, not really knowledge difficulty. I'm going to say creative difficulty. A knowledge difficulty, that might be like the game has a pattern of boss attacks and you have to know what they are, or that you can avoid them with this ability, or that these two abilities interact, things you can just look up, basically. So there's a type of difficulty coming here if your build gets harder and harder to improve that isn't really mechanical, you can practice it and learn muscle memory difficulty, and isn't really knowledge-based difficulty, you can just learn something and then you just know that fact and then you have that information. It's kind of creative difficulty. If you don't have a novel idea for what will make the thing stronger, it will usually not get stronger. I would also like to point out that at this point, Hades has made it very, very unlikely that a random boon will benefit your loadout at all. making it harder and harder for something to increase your kit's damage, has created a situation where if you treat the game as giving you random upgrades, you might as well assume that you will not get any more powerful. You have to intentionally pick a specific upgrade, or the chance of you getting much stronger is ridiculously low, like basically zero. Which is interesting. You can see what I meant at the beginning. Arguably, this is like it unbecomes a roguelike. If you try to luck into something that makes you powerful, the game has been structured in a way where that will be systematically made irrelevantly unlikely, which is kind of weird to realize. Even if you don't play Hades as a game where you have a lot of control over the randomness, the game is structured in a way where each run, you will make it increasingly close to zero, the chance that you will get something that will randomly make you stronger. So the game is putting in front of you a very difficult type of difficulty where you can't just learn a thing or keep trying. You have to have an idea, or you basically can't access any further power in the game. That is a risky type of difficulty to include in a game, because if the game's structure doesn't fire the neurons in your specific player's head, they might just not get it. In fact, I've heard many people say that they think the difficulty in Hades becomes a matter of lucking into a powerful build to advance forward. And I just haven't played that video game. Like, when I play Hades, I have never once thought that. It's not because they're wrong and I'm right. It's because Hades pushes my buttons, and I think that it's asking to push pretty specific buttons. Anyway, I think that this is a risky approach. I would like to describe a few other variants because we used Hades very heavily as an example. I think it's a really good example, but there are a few other ways that you could achieve a kind of keeping pace difficulty model that aren't necessarily specific to roguelikes, but which I would like to highlight because I think they're interesting. You can see Hades kind of doing some of these things too. I have two. So the first one I'm going to call a diminishing returns model. The idea here is that you let the player keep stacking effectiveness onto the same thing, but the relative gains get worse and worse because you give them the same benefit every time. An example of this would be, I guess Dead Cells kind of does this. Dead Cells does have some interesting, and a topic for another time, like anti-diminishing returns math. Let me briefly explain, but you'll see what I mean. So you can increase 3 colored stats, red, purple, and green, in Dead Cells, and they'll scale things of that color on your kit. Let's say your weapon is purple, or it will scale with purple, and you stack up a bunch of purple. First time, you get, let's say, 10% more damage. You increased your damage output by 10%. If the game were to then give you 10% more damage, and it just added to what you had, you'd be gaining a little less than 10%, about 9% total damage output. That might sound like it doesn't matter, but you get this upgrade like 20 times in a run in Dead Cells. So by the time you've gotten it 15 times, that 10% damage, that was a 10% overall damage increase at first, has now dwindled to only increasing your total damage output by like 3 or 5%. Like, not a very significant increase. You won't really notice. But Dead Cells knows this, and so when you stack up a stat over and over again, you get a little bit more each time. Like that second time you get 10% more damage, the game gives you 11%, so now you really did gain 10% relative damage. And then the next time you get 12%, or you get it. The game makes it so your absolute gain in overall damage output remains an increased 10% each time. However, obviously that still isn't as valuable as when you had way less damage. Now you have like 300% more damage, and the game is going to call to that and give you like, 30% more damage for 1 purple upgrade. But you already have so much damage that enemies that are weaker will just die. Like, it can still be enough damage. Against bosses, this is a different story, but you get my point. There is still a way in which the game prevents you from, increasing by leaps and bounds. The amount of damage you're going to get is going to be within a certain mathematical ballpark that is sort of determined at the start of the run. In Dead Cells, it's pretty easy to predict about how many times you will get that purple upgrade in a given run. And you can take some side paths to get a few more, but it's gonna be, around, I don't remember exactly, but like 25, for an example. The amount of damage you get is not actually very variable. The game kind of just ramps you up to a set known amount of damage over time. And exactly how you get items that utilize that damage, that's a different story, but you can see how this is a different approach. The game isn't really challenging you to find more damage places. in that part of the system where you're stacking up a colored stat, it's really just saying this is the amount of damage you're gonna get. You need to keep pace. It really fits this model quite well with the amount of damage we expect you to have at each stage of the run. And you need to keep getting good weapons, for example, that utilize that damage, or you will fall behind. The kind of a different meaning of keeping pace. You're not really inventing new ways to get more damage out of your loadout. At least that's not how it feels to me. It's more like you are keeping up, trying to keep everything up to date, tuned up, rather than it being a kind of creative difficulty in the same way. Whenever something sounds uncreative, that sounds like a negative, but I hope you know what I mean. You're not meant to like invent a new way to do more damage. That's not as much of a thing in my experience. It's just a matter of finding a way to keep up with the game's scaling. In a different way from Hades, I think. Another example quickly is what I'm going to call a rules of engagement are set model. So this would be like Baldur's Gate 3 maybe, or Dungeons and Dragons. The source material is fine too. The idea is that the rules of engagement for a fight in Baldur's Gate are largely the same at all difficulty levels. So the game's relative difficulty is more static than it would appear, even though your player character gets much stronger, because things like the action economy or being able to flank enemies and attack them multiple times in a turn to kill them before they can do damage to you, those things remain part of the rules of engagement from the start. So even though your character's health is going to go 10 times what it started as, and your damage output is going to increase by 2 or 3 times, though note how much smaller of an increase that is, the way that you win a fight is ultimately determined by the same rules from the start. So although the numbers will vary, fights are surprisingly more balanceable in these games because of, yes, people that are way into D&D, things like bounded accuracy and stuff, but that's for another time. The point is, the game makes the fundamental rules of engagement kind of set, so you can still get the feeling of scaling things up and occasionally do really powerful stuff, but often it will be like you use the spell slot, like a high-level spell slot, and you can't keep doing that. I can do 70 damage on my character once per short rest, and then it averages out over the course of all the fights. If you really push between short rests anyway, which I do, you won't end up doing a particularly different amount of damage. The rules of engagement and I guess attrition have not changed between fights. You could imagine a roguelike like that. In fact, a game that is like Baldur's Gate but is a roguelike sounds like a very good and incredibly obvious idea. I'm sure that we will see such a thing in, my notes say 2 years tops. So look forward to that. That sounds delightful. I feel like that would be kind of easy to make too. Or you could just mod Baldur's Gate to, anyway, whatever. Okay, that's enough waffling about the keeping pace model. I think that's very interesting, so I'm going forever on this parlay because I'm very excited about it. But I think the keeping pace model is surprisingly in-depth. It sounds simple. You just keep pace with the game's difficulty level, right? But how the build system, if it's about having a meaningful build system, how that is going to have the player keep pace is surprisingly complicated under the hood, in my opinion. You're going to need to do some weird math and/or opportunity cost things, and or have there be some kind of underlying system that sort of cheats, and therefore the math can seem to be getting way bigger, but it's actually not, like in Baldur's Gate, for the balancing to stay the same. Again, at its best, you could argue the keeping pace model means you're always making meaningful build decisions, and the game's difficulty is attempting to be always engaging. It's always a meaningful challenge for what you have. A very, very aggressive and ambitious implementation of game balance to make the difficulty feel engaging and stimulating at all points throughout the run. That is a very challenging thing to do. I do not think that that is simple or easy. I think that the escape velocity model is very basic, but you said something that may change my opinion about that, so let's get into that now. Escape velocity model. It sounds, and this is my bias coming into the subject because I don't tend to like these experiences. When it sounds like you just combo off and it's random if you get the combo, this model sounds bad to people who are listening to this parlay and like making builds anyway. It sounds like, what's even the point of playing? You essentially pull a slot machine lever, but you have to play for 30 minutes to find out if you got jackpot, and the game is only fun if you get jackpot. that's bad, right? But that's not what they're trying to do if they're using the model in an effective way. I particularly like the way you put this, Lordrusty. This was a gem for me. I can't believe that I didn't think this sooner. That's glorious. You said, people learning the game with an escape velocity model can take increases to power early on to better learn the game systems. But in order to win, there's a skill check on being able to clear early levels with little to no buffs in order to get enough lift to escape orbit with a full build and tackle the last third of the game. How exactly you would implement a system like that so that that is true is a little bit tricky, but that is a very interesting and intelligent model. This allows you to create a game where the build system is not irrelevant to players just learning, and yet it provides something that makes sense when the player is really good. You get a lot of upgrades that will scale, which you need, or you're designed to need, if you're to challenge the higher difficulty levels, and a lot of immediate power gains, which will allow early game players to play the early part of the game because they're not quite ready to scale up to the late game, and will allow late game players to take an immediate power increase in the late game once they've scaled up using those early game scaling multipliers. Cool. So it might be useful to have a specific example, and I don't know this game you mentioned, OTXO, though I will obviously be looking at it now. That sounds very cool. Got to take a look. But we're just going to make up an example. So we only need one example of each of the two multipliers. I just want to make sure people have a firm idea of how you would even do that in a game's build system. So the first one is you're going to get an upgrade that lets you do, you get 1% critical chance per level. And crits multiply your damage by 2 in this game. This game that doesn't exist that I'm making up for an example, just to be clear. I don't know if they do in OTXO, and in Hades they actually don't work like that, but that's a topic for another time. In this game, a crit multiplies your damage by 2, and you get 1% crit chance per level. There's another upgrade that gives you 50% more damage now. No upgrade as it scales. And there are 100 levels. It's easy to see that the 50% damage upgrade is hilariously overpowered for the early part of the game. But if you don't take the crit scaling upgrade early enough, then you won't have anywhere near as much damage as you could have by the time you get to floor 100. If you wait 50 levels to take the crit scaling effect, you have only half the damage at level 100 of a player that took the crit scaling effect at level 1. But if you take the crit scaling effect at level 1, you don't have the 50% damage increase. I don't know how you get upgrades in this game, but you get the example. Taking that crit upgrade as soon as possible makes you dramatically stronger at the higher floors, but does practically nothing when you take it on the spot. It literally increases your damage by 1% per floor. So the challenge then is to be skilled enough at the game, or possibly to bootstrap a build that still has some good synergy early in the game, but will do something later. To get you through the early floors while that crit buff scales up, and then to be able to stall taking the 50% damage increase long enough that you can take a bunch of scaling effects instead, and then take it at the end when it brings all of your damage online. Just take it later, basically. You're better off the later you take the effects that don't scale, and there is the game's challenge. Yet, you can take effects that make you stronger in the short term as well. They exist in the system, and they have a purpose for both new and experienced players. Brilliant. Sounds very elegant, doesn't it? Absolutely. Now, I think it's worth saying that this has a lot of overlap with the way I depicted the keeping pace model. I mean, if the keeping pace model is meant to give you challenge by making it harder and harder to add damage to your build, I mean, isn't that what you do with the example I just gave? It's not hard in my model because we have only 2 upgrades, but once you've got all those scaling effects, you go, okay, what can I take that is an upfront damage boost? It has to give me damage now because I can't scale it up. All those scaling boosts are obviously good, but I'm too late in the run to get them. They won't scale in time. So what can I take that will scale with all the stuff I have, that actually works with all the stuff I have, that gives me an effect right now that would normally not have been very good earlier in the run? I wouldn't have scaled, but now that's all I can get, right? You can imagine a system where it would be hard to find damage like that. Kind of like the keeping pace model. And yet, you are going to get an explosive effectiveness increase. Imagine a few more upgrades that double your damage when you get a crit and scale every level. And then by the time you're at level 100 in my contrived example game, if you get an upgrade that gives you 50% more damage and it multiplies with all of those things, your damage like quadruples on the spot for the boss fight. You would never be able to beat a boss fight designed for that level of damage if you didn't have quadruple the level of damage. You can see how it would feel like you need to come up with a way to scale all that damage effectively. I'm a little worried that such a system would devolve into Mathcraft, though. In my notes, I have a few other examples of like how, like ways that you could hit escape velocity that I want to talk about. So let's talk about them briefly. You know, I said early on in the parlay that I think for a lot of people, this type of like a roguelike game structure is basically just about getting lucky and your build pops off and then you win when that happens, and it's not well balanced when that doesn't happen. That isn't actually true of most games that I've played that a lot of people like that you would call a roguelike, but most people I have spoken to describe them that way. For example, I've heard most people describe Hades and Risk of Rain 2, which are games that have very different, if you can even call Risk of Rain 2 a build systems. But I've heard people describe both games the same way. The thing you do in these games, they say, the one single thing that you do, according to them, is you try to get good upgrades, and if you randomly do get good upgrades, then your run pops off and you destroy the known universe, and there you go. If you've played Hades and Risk of Rain 2, it's a little difficult to imagine the person likes the game Hades. I feel like Risk of Rain 2 does that more dramatically. But those games have very different models. I of course, don't think that's entirely accurate. That person has just only experienced that way of playing those games. Many of them allow a version of the gameplay where you have a build in mind and you plan around getting it, and it's more of a keeping pace model where you just have to make sure you get enough support for your build at key moments. But you can also look at it from the perspective of John Escape Velocity over there, who said that every single game is about getting lucky combos. The combo model of Escape Velocity, let's talk about that first. There are games where the way you get the combo for Escape Velocity is literally a combo. You have to get enough support for bleed effects to keep the bleed chain going, and then you will get a ton of damage if you get them all, but only 10% of the effects in the game do anything related to bleed, and you need to get the few that combine together to make a super overpowered bleed math machine go burr, and then you will win. And so the challenge of the game, if you will, is to plan to get those upgrades in time so that the damage scales by big jumps, often in a very mathematic way. You have to think about which ones are the biggest upgrades and then prioritize targeting those early or at the key moment, or like get one of the important parts of the bleed machine at a time when you can afford to not increase your power level by very much. Something like that. I've played games that do this before. You could argue Risk of Rain 2 is like this, where in Risk of Rain 2, for example, a lot of items trigger other items. And one of the key upgrades you can get in your run in Risk of Rain 2 is a way to do area of effect triggers. So if you have an item that can make enemies bleed or have a time bomb on them or whatever, you can just shoot enemies or whatever, but you probably won't be able to inflict that effect except on a single target or very tightly grouped enemies. So finding an item that lets you chain lightning or fire a homing missile at a nearby target or whatever, so you can hit multiple targets and trigger your effects on multiple targets, which could then trigger on those targets and spread to more targets, really exponentially increases your damage output. But like in the example with the crit scaling before, obviously that doesn't do that much unless you have effects that trigger when you hit enemies. So you have to figure out when to get those things, / you don't have much control over when you get those things. So around a certain point, you will hopefully get those, and the run will change its flavor. Suddenly you can evaporate groups of enemies, but a lone enemy takes not much more damage than they did before. It's weird. But Risk of Rain 2 is a useful example in that way. In my notes, I wrote that there is, I think, another model, which you might call the mathy model for escape velocity. The idea here would be you just get a bunch of multipliers. But in reality, I think they're rather similar, and the difference is mostly nominal. You know, maybe the game says that you get bleed duration, and you inflict more bleed with this, and then so those combine and you end up getting way more bleed for your bleed, so you can bleed while you bleed. Or the game might say you crit and you get base damage, and those things scale that way. But the math of you getting more powerful is actually kind of the same in both cases. The idea would be that you have some way to get more powerful that massively force multiplies other ways you get more powerful, especially over time, or if you get more upgrades of that type. And then you end up being able to cash in on lots of other effects, like if the enemy has so and so much bleed, you do way more damage, which you can now, you don't even have to set that up. Enemies always have a lot of bleed now, and then you can just pick that up. You get it. So I don't know. I mean, the game designer in me says that the pitfall of this one would be if you make upgrades that need to be enabled, like the one I just said. If you have a lot of bleed, you do more damage to this target. I would argue those are bad for this model because they don't serve as a way to scale you to the late game, and they are not useful for new players. If you have only things in the game that are power right now that could be multiplied by some effect, and power later that could multiply some other effects, then things are relevant to early and late game players. And the challenge of the game, like Lordrusty put it, is to take enough of the scaling effects that you can scale to late game without making yourself so unpowerful that you die in the early game. But if you put in a lot of effects that only work when they're turned on, you are already scaling, your build is already going burr, and then you can enable them. Those effects are only useful to players who have essentially already won. You would argue they're kind of win more. Players in the early game who want immediate power can't enable them because they don't have those effects yet. And players who've scaled to the late game have kind of done the thing already, and so what really is the point of just handing them even more power? They can already multiply any effect you've given them by a lot, so it doesn't really matter if the effect needs to be turned on anymore. It's either useless no matter what, or they have already turned it on and therefore the condition is irrelevant. So I would argue it's not beneficial to do effects like that. It depends on the game. I can think of games that do that kind of thing and it totally makes sense. But for this model, I don't think it does. Okay, lots of discussion about both the keeping pace and escape velocity models. I do have one last thing to say about the escape velocity model. This one in my notes I called the opposing forms of challenge model. This would be that the game makes you try to manage not over or under investing in this or that too much. A simple example might be something like you need to invest in your defenses, but also in your offense, and those you put upgrades to get those things in a space that has the same opportunity cost. You'll be given one upgrade, and you can pick a defensive upgrade or an offensive upgrade. You have 8 slots for mods in Warframe, and you can put a mod that is defensive or offensive. And unless you have something overpowered where you can get both from the same thing, which is like 90% of Warframes, which is one reason Warframe is so easy if you have a full build built, and relatively harder if you don't, then you have to make a choice. Of course, most games fall into the dead enemies do no damage fallacy. If you don't make it so enemies are guaranteed some damage on you, then defensive upgrades are just bad in most games like that. I think that it is good for enemies to be able to do some amount of damage to you if you want this type of challenge in the game. Is the player meant to avoid all damage? And I would also argue in those games, if the player is meant to be able to just stack offensive buffs and avoid all damage, just remove defensive upgrades from the game. They're always the wrong choice anyway, so just take them out. You could add them as an early game crutch, but it seems better to do that by adding offensive upgrades that will scale in the late game for the more experienced players. That seems like a more efficient use of space. But you could make a game, and there are games like this, where you cannot possibly avoid taking damage, so you have to balance those two things. These games can be pretty mathy, in my experience. An example would be, I think Path of Exile is a good example of this type of game, not necessarily roguelikes. A lot of raid content for MMORPGs, like when I played some World of Warcraft raiding a very long time ago now, that is a little bit like that. You really can't only invest in defense or offense in a lot of these games. Like, it's quite difficult to do that, but you are meant to balance those, make some concessions for defense and offense a good amount of the time. It depends on the character. In World of Warcraft, it's more like your team composition. Like you need to take some healers and bring damage dealers and bring a tank to balance your defense and offense on your team, but within each individual character, there's really just a right answer for what gear to use. I think these games are often not interesting to make builds for, but you could make a build system like that. There are definitely choices for your build in Path of Exile, but you also generally want to balance the defense and offense of your build so that you can make some kind of overpowered lifesteal loop or whatever. I haven't played a ton of Path of Exile, but a lot of builds that you see, you'll notice, are doing some kind of offense gives you healing, but they did have to pay some raw offense power to get that healing. Which, yeah, that is another way you could balance such a thing. I think that's true in Risk of Rain 2 as well. There are a lot of upgrades that give you lifesteal or healing or something that could really slow down how much damage you're dealing, but you do want some source of healing a lot of the time. And finding ways to not overheal yourself is one of the ways that you can play more effectively in Risk of Rain 2. Finding like ways to get barrier if you already have enough healing, a little bit of healing, a little bit of barrier. That way you don't overheal or over barrier yourself, and you have both going at the same time. It can be much more effective than having too much of the other. But again, that's just back to multipliers. My point is that if you have those two axes of increasing your effectiveness, your survivability and your damage, and they both involve multipliers, suddenly you have to very carefully balance. And if you have 4 total upgrades, having them all be for one or the other doesn't as overpoweredly scale your damage. You might be quadrupling your damage output, but you have no survivability and you die immediately. If you put 3 damage and 1 survivability, well, you're still not tanky enough, because if you put just 1 more survivability upgrade, it would multiply that value by 2. So now if you do 2 and 2, then you have the best of both worlds, but your damage is kind of low, so it's tempting to get more damage, and there's a real balance. It feels like it's a real option, or it really makes sense and is a valid decision to balance multiple ways, even though the use of multipliers makes it feel like you just want to stack up effectiveness to infinity. So balancing the sort of escape velocity feeling a little bit, where an upgrade gives you a massive effectiveness increase, and yet it isn't as straightforward as just pick the massive effectiveness increase, can be interesting. I actually can't think of a great... If you could pick your upgrades in Risk of Rain 2 and they rebalance the entire game, maybe it would be like that, but that'd be a very different game. Okay, just some closing thoughts. I ended up structuring it differently. I talked about the benefits for each of the 2 models during each of the 2 model discussions, but I do have a few other things to say. My game designer credo is to look at a situation like this and say, how can we have both at once? I will do everything I possibly can to get both of them at the same time. And then if we can't, we can't, but I only want to accept that if we've really tried. And so I think it's clear to see that the keeping pace and escape velocity models both have some merits. A really strong point of the escape velocity design model that I had never thought of before, as Lordrusty puts it, is that the upgrades that can make you scale on the spot later in the game, after you've taken the upgrades for the long run as an experienced player, those same on the spot, scale yourself up later upgrades can be what makes it easier for newer players to get into the game when they're not ready to have no power at the early levels. That's really clever. That's a very elegant piece of design, I think. And it means that you have to figure out the order of taking upgrades that makes the most sense, where it's kind of always exciting to get a certain upgrade at a certain time, and you're really torn between the decisions. I will always say, if the game is meant to be about making builds, the decision should be hard. If they weren't meaningful decisions, there's no need to make them. Making a player make a decision turns tons of people off. If you're going to do it and have it be fun for the people that want that, make the decision matter. If it doesn't matter, don't make the player make the decision. And I think that that is a very good example of those decisions being of the utmost import. If things are hard, but you know you need to scale for the long run, do you take this moment to take the scaling upgrade, or do you take the immediate power? And you know you have to do some of each, but in what moment are you doing that? That is kind of exciting. There's a real push and pull there. It feels very gamey. At the same time, gamey like a wild bear. Like, it feels game-like. I don't know. You get it. On the other hand, the keeping pace model, it feels synergistic with that. It feels like, well, if the game is always raising the water level of the difficulty, you gotta stay above the surface by constantly getting more power every room, right? but you have to scale into the late game, and so there's also some need to take some hits early on to kind of plan for the long run. Combining those models or embracing both feelings seems really, really good. So I feel like it's worth discussing how maybe you could do that. When I said I want to try as hard as I can to combine them, but maybe you just can't, one of the things that I was trying to allude to is that for the people that just want to randomly succeed or whatever, I really do think that if you were to make a game to optimize for that feeling, it's quite difficult for it to be enjoyable for people who want it to be a build experience. Do you see what I mean? If you're going to make it so the player actually does randomly luck into a really powerful build a significant amount of the time, you've seen how both of these models, when they're doing the good game design stuff they can do, they're almost designed to make it unlikely that you will luck into a good upgrade. Getting an upgrade at a random time, or a random upgrade at a random time, it is almost systematically going to be bad in both of these models. So making a game that is thrilling if you don't have a build in mind, and yet is still good if you do have a build in mind, sounds very difficult to me. As the person who will always fight tooth and nail to get them to do both, I feel like that I'm not sure that's that doable at the moment anyway. You know, I guess the fact that I think Hades is a game that gives you a lot of agency, and yet lots of people felt like it was really random, that might seem like, so they did it, right? But most people who mentioned that about Hades, that I heard anyway, mentioned it as a negative about Hades. They didn't like that the game felt not good when you had to kind of luck into a powerful build, because the game was never trying to feel like that, I propose. And indeed, you imagine, well, that wouldn't happen very often. Wow, that must have sucked for them, right? Why didn't they try to just make a good build on purpose? You can do that. What happened? And I don't know what happened, but the point is, I do not think that Hades is a good example of that going well. I think Hades is a very well-made build system, not a very well-made, let's call them a casino roguelike. How about that? That's fun, and we're only going to use the term for like 3 more minutes. So it's okay that that's cringe. The casino roguelike it is. I'm not entirely sure you can capture that feeling while also getting like the good stuff in the keep pace and escape velocity models. But combine them, yeah, I mean, looking at them, I feel like they're more and more similar in a way. The key thing in my mind is having some kind of, it feels like to get the escape velocity feeling as well, you can allow the player the possibility that they get a very difficult to achieve combination of effects, but just make it very difficult and like risky to do that. You know, they have to really abandon temporary power to get very specific upgrades. So it's not so much that the upgrade is rare or really random, it's just that the number of upgrades that would apply to multiply their damage really effectively with a very specific strategy, the number of upgrades that apply is very low if they do that. Therefore, if they invest resources in looking for those upgrades, they may mess up their build scaling. But if they can get it, then the build is really powerful. You could imagine a game where you have kind of 3 different motivations. You want to keep pace with the game's scaling. You want to scale for the long term. But in the back of your mind, if you had a free moment, it would be really good if I got that upgrade as well. And so you might spend a few of those water level always rising moments trying to get one of those upgrades as well. And if you can balance all 3 things well, you'll have enough power in the early game, you will scale into the late game, and you will be slowly chipping away at that rainy day project throughout the run to make the God Killer, you know, some incredibly overpowered combo on top of the build that you managed to get to scale, on top of having enough power for the early game. And then I think the Slay the Spire model feels really good. Allow the player a challenge on top of the challenge of the final boss. If they were to achieve the God Hand, you know, give them something to throw it at. I actually think this is very simple when you get it to that point. In Hades, for example, you fight the final boss, and then you do the thing at the end of, if you've played Hades, you know, you do the thing at the end of the run, and, you know, you go back to the start. You know what I mean, right? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If you're gonna die anyway, why not have it be to an almost unbeatable boss that you could potentially beat? Vampire Survivors has done basically this same format. There are bosses throughout your 30-minute run, and then at the end of the 30 minutes, you win the run but you are killed by a seemingly invincible Reaper. There is a way in the game to kill the Reapers. I will leave it at that so as to avoid spoilers if people decide to play Vampire Survivors. But to be blunt, if you've been listening to this parlay, I think you're probably going to figure it out. So I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. You can totally do that. And then you get a game where if you are able to achieve that sort of overclock version of a build, it feels really good. But the basic success is about balancing those things, making intelligent build decisions, figuring out what will make this build stronger. And then if you have the extra time, you can do a side project and get a kind of payoff for it. That feels pretty cool. For what it's worth, that sounds like how I feel when I play Hades a lot of the time. But not that many builds. Like, I would want to structure a game in such a way where it really felt like the side project part was more of a core mechanic rather than just something you could do if you were crazy and knew every single thing in the game at all times. Like that, it doesn't feel like a fully integrated part of Hades. You can do it in Hades, but I would like to see a game that kind of embraced that a little bit more, which I have an idea for, but I can't tell you that right now. We just don't have time. Okay, super long parlay because I really liked it. So thank you very much for this parlay, Lordrusty. I really enjoyed the way you described the escape velocity model. I kind of went off script a little as you asked when and where have these models been deployed in games, because you had pretty good examples and I don't have that many good examples because I don't like the escape velocity model as I've experienced it most of the time. And I play a wide variety of games, which means not that many of them are roguelikes. / I'm a little cynical about the genre. I am biased, probably wrongly, to expect more of them to be the escape velocity, but like the really cheap version, casino roguelikes, as I described them before. And I think that is literally just wrong. The more I hear all of you mentioning them, and then talking about a topic that I absolutely love, I mean, there can only be so few that have something I would like in them if you all keep bringing up ones I have never heard of and which sound incredibly interesting to me. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, of course, is that it might feel like everybody is oversimplifying them to be casinos where you just luck into a powerful build and it is not designed for your build systems to matter. But those are just the vocal few people. And I'm the one always saying that, but maybe I've forgotten that in this moment. So I don't know, this year maybe I'll play a lot more of these. I'm certainly going to take a look at some of the games you mentioned. Thank you. This was a genuinely very useful parlay for me. I thought it was really fun. So I hope you were okay with the direction I took it in. I just felt like I had the best thing to say about that, even though I didn't extremely directly answer your question. I hope I still talked a lot about the topic you were interested in. Thank you very much.